Do you want to go ahead and start this out? I don't know why this is happening. Because it was fine just now.
Yeah, it might take
Mm.
some time. So
It's on. I don't know why it's not starting.
you
Maybe
want
you
to leave
start,
and join once again?
leave and join again. Okay.
Will that help?
I've never used Google Meets before, so I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, you're
Oh, there you
yeah, sure. So it's 5:40 on Pura. Should we begin now?
Shall we start? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very good evening to everyone and very warm welcome on behalf of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IISER Bhopal. First of all, a very warm welcome and thank you to panelists who have kindly agreed to come online on this panel and talk to us and interact over this online platform here this evening. So the panelists, Trina, Banerjee, Tathagata, Chowdhury, Prodosh, Bhattacharya and Debleena, Tripathi. Very warm welcome and thank you for being here. And so we have a very interesting session ahead of us here, a panel discussion on theatre, space and practice. So I'd like to thank the panelists and my colleague Anuparna Mukherjee for organizing this on behalf of the department and for coordinating with the speakers and managing to get them all here. So without much ado, we would move on to the panel. So I think Anuparna will tell us more about the structure that she has in mind. Just before I hand on to Anuparna for the formal introductions and just setting the stage for the discussion that is to follow. I'll just take this opportunity to welcome everyone again in the audience and also take this opportunity to welcome our new PhD students who some of them are also here, I presume, who have been invited to this event and they are set to join us in a week or 10 days. So welcome will follow formally, but before that, a very warm welcome to IISER Bhopal and to the department family. So I'll hand over to Anuparna, and we really look forward to this session and to learning from the panelists from their experience and expertise.
So thank you, Antara, for the head start. So before we move into the main panel, let me begin with a little proviso. So we envision this event as an extension of an introductory course on modern theatre, which I had offered last semester. So we had Karnat's Hayavadan as one of the texts in the syllabus, where we discussed, of course, the spatial innovations with folk forms in relation to, its performance history and all these contending notions of modernity and modernism in India, apart from other things. But what I observed was there was a kind of a lacuna. Because without a first-hand experience of a play which is so enmeshed in the folk motives, or without watching, similar performance trajectories, it's kind of, it was more like scratching the surface. So then our plan was to kind of, go out into the city and explore the theatre scene, once we're done with the reading. But, and I'm told that if you know the right places in the city, that you can actually find performers, practicing with all the percussions in private courtyards, or for that matter, little garage or backyards of the houses. And I have seen at least one such, groups. So, and as you might be aware, that Madhya Pradesh in general and Bhopal in particular is called the cultural capital of the state. Of course, apart from being the administrative capital, it has a very rich history of performative traditions. It holds one of the legends of modern Indian theatre, Habib Tanveer and his troops. Of course, Tanveer is no longer there with us, but then we have a very rich legacy of, performance, which was kind of established, kind of founded by Habib Tanveer with his Naya Theatre in 1959. So that was the plan initially, to kind of go out and explore. We also planned that, after we garner some experience and understanding, we're going to put together a creative adaptation of one of the plays in the syllabus as a kind of hands-on experience. But then when we proposed, Corona disposed in a certain sense. Students were students rushed back and we were kind of confined to our homes, and we had to figure out, alternative ways of continuing our exploration and dialogue, basically for the sanity of the body and the mind. So that's where the panel kind of comes in. So we have experts who are simultaneously performers and teachers / researchers. So they can bring a balance between, drama as pedagogy and drama as a living practice, kind of straddle the divides between the literary, affective, and the performative, so as to say. So with this, of course, I'll soon hand over the proceedings to Rishdun. But before that, I would like to express, kindly, if you could all mute your microphones, that would be great. If you could all mute your microphones to avoid disturbances. So, before handing over the, the proceedings to Rishdun, I would like to express, our deep sadness in certain sense at the loss of Ibrahim Al-Qazi. In fact, while I was kind of consolidating, putting together the emails, the final, whatever touch-ups for the, doing the final touch-ups for this event, my thoughts were constantly kind of overshadowed last week by this death of he's not only a doyen, but also, one of the, the last of the Mohicans, if we may say. And when we think about, alternative spatial practices in theatre, obviously, we can never sort of forget those legendary performances in Feroz, the war-torn grounds of Feroz Shah Kotla or Purana Killa, the performances of Haramveer Bharti's Andhayu, Tuklak, and so on and so forth. So, that was there, of course, in the last few years, he wasn't really performing that much, but having him around or having people like him around is in itself very comforting. Anyway, these are very trying times for all the, personal and collective losses and bereavements that we had in the last few months. But history has also kind of shown us that these despairing times, which are torn with conflict, ridden with sorrow, are also moments of great churning and creative outputs. So let us proceed with, Beckett's sagely words, which kind of became a refrain in my entire course this time. And it's only fitting that I kind of, hand over the space with those words. You must go on. I can't go on. I will go on. So let's go on. Rishdun, please take over and introduce our first panelist.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. So warm greetings to everyone here who have tuned in today. It is indeed like a privilege that I have been asked by Anuparna ma'am to introduce our first speaker for the day and carry on the proceedings for the event today. Personally, myself, I have been like a person who's a theater enthusiast who has done some theater for a long time. And when I saw ma'am's course on modern theater in IISER Bhopal in my first year, I just couldn't it was so tempting that I had to carry on along as an additional course. This was not a part of my original curriculum, and take this course fully, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the day. So our first speaker is Mr. Tathagata Chowdhury. Tathagata Da, as I call him, I have known him for, I think, 2 or 3 years I think the last time I spoke to him was when I was like in my school, Don Bosco Park Cities, and he came down to judge a theater one act play called Bosco Impact. It's a competition in our fest. And I remember first when I heard about him was from Shinjon Mitro, who is the founder of Script Productions. And Shinjon told me about Tathagata, who is the founder of Theatrecian. Like as his credentials show, in 2007, the BBC declared Theatrecian as one of the most prolific youth theatre companies in the country. In the last 19 years since his inception, and as he's been in inception, TC, as he's fondly called by his friends, has produced more than 200 productions and presented nearly 1,000 shows all across the globe. So when I first heard about him, I was so intrigued and so inspired, being a student who was doing school theatre and some amount of novice amateur theatre in the circuit, to be inspired by him. Therefore, when I even spoke to him, it was a lovely experience. He has also been a TEDx speaker, represented the country at the South Asian Theatre Festival, Ohio. He's directed plays scripted by painter Joss Auburn, Albi, Girish Kannad, Vijay Tendulkar, the likes of and the likes. And he's also hosted and directed many original plays himself. He's acted in feature films and serials. He's a recipient of the Kalakranti Best Actor and Best Playwright Awards in 2007. Tathagata is also an advocate, registered with the Calcutta High Court, and having taught theatre studies at Madhavi Birla World Academy. He's now a faculty with Pathway World School, Aravali. That's I think, the amphitheatre you can see just behind him in the background. He's teaching theatre and film studies. It's my extreme pleasure and to welcome all the guests and to hand it over to Tathagata to start.
So before I would just intervene for a second. So again, I would reiterate the request that if you could kindly sort of, mute your microphones if possible to avoid, all kinds of interruptions. That's one. And two, the speakers will speak for 15 minutes each. And after the first set of deliberations, we're going to take the Q&A, the questions together. So hold on to your questions and type them in your chat box. So once we are done with the first set of speeches, and then we're going to open the house to Q&A, right? Okay, thank you. So over to you, Tathagata.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Firstly, thank you so much for organizing something like this. I was just telling ma'am before this entire discussion started that, there's really a need of the hour for practitioners, for theatre personalities to come together and just, discuss about how we can kind of, make good use of space. There are different spaces, as we have already heard, and basically just understand what kind of theatre will kind of suit a certain kind of space. And this particular, what we are doing right now, using this platform to discuss, using this platform to share ideas, exchange ideas, this itself is extremely challenging. And as I say that, just in case you feel that there is a lag, whether, I'm being seen or not, or I'm being heard or not, just let me know. I'll try to do something with my gadget, but I'm not too sure whether, uh, how much I'll be able to achieve. So having said that, am I audible right now? Can people hear me?
Yes, Tathagata, you're audible.
Right, thank you. So I'll begin with what I consider my definition first for acting, and then I'll carry that forward about what I feel theater is to me. Uh, for me, I think that what the mind tells the body to do at a given space is acting. And theater is complete only when we have eyes to see and ears to hear what the mind is telling that particular person's body to do at that given space. So, this mind body space, this correlation is extremely important, and it is incomplete without an audience. We need to have eyes to see and ears to hear what actually the mind is telling the body to do at a given space. Which kind of brings me to the fact that what theater practitioners have found it really difficult, and that difficulty is still there, is to reach out, to get an audience to come and watch what we want to convey, what we want to kind of discuss. It has been a struggle to do theater in English, especially in a place like Calcutta. We started with Calcutta first. Now, of course, it is pan India, and we are also kind of performing abroad. Uh, it was very difficult for us to convince people that, like, come and watch what we have to convey, what we have to say. If you're doing something like the Comedy Kitchen, which is kind of, like a collection of comedies and perhaps not that very cerebral, then we do have a good audience. But the moment we kind of, like, do theater of the absurd, or we are coming up with some of our own original works. So there is a question that, like, how does Pinter work for me today? How does Samuel Beckett work for me today? What use do I have for Edward Albee? And I just personally feel that not only through our performances, but through dialogues, through conversation, if we reach out, we'll actually understand their relevance. And what is important is that how theater pieces help us think. It is important to kind of, like, evoke thoughts, and that is the purpose of theater. During one of my earlier conversations with Shamananji, he had told me that, like, he personally feels that if one needs entertainment, one can go to cinema. But if one needs thoughts, if one needs to think, then theater's main purpose, theater's main aim is to engage people, make them think, make it thought provoking, evoke a certain emotion. And the space that we select for our particular pieces, for our performances, in the manner that we use space, that also plays a very important part in how we evoke emotion. We heard ma'am talk about Habib Tanveer. Of course, Habib Saab has kind of, like, given us a certain structure of theater, and he made it conducive in a certain way, going by the kind of space that he was using. And if you're talking about Habib Tanveer, obviously we'll need to talk about Bahadur Sarkar as well. The kind of structure that, like, when you see Eva Mindrajit being performed, and Bahadur Sarkar's most of his plays were street plays. He is not someone who kind of stayed away from the proscenium with a purpose, but he just felt that if theater was not restricted to what he would consider the bourgeois, then maybe, like, there would be a better opportunity for people to understand what he was wanting to communicate, what he was wanting to convey. And that is why I think, like, he chose a structure. He kind of considered a particular structure which was reaching out to more people. And of course, when we talk about structure, when we talk about space, the performer needs to keep in mind, the actor needs to keep in mind that every structure will have its own demands. Right now, I am at a given space, and I must tell you that I'm really fortunate that I can come to a physical space over here. I would like you to have a look at this. So this is a very unique kind of a amphitheater setup that we have here. It is open air. You can actually hear birds chirping while I'm talking to you here. And this particular space will have its own demand. It will have its own structure. It will have its own grammar. Uh, Vis-a-vis, if I go to the proscenium and the doors are shut and there is a fourth wall to respect, then that particular space will have its own grammar. It will have its own structure. Uh, Today, what is happening is that there are very interesting spaces coming up. We have performed plays at cafeterias. We are doing theater in different cafeterias, um, backyards, going to places which are actually in ruins, and making that a part of the script. So the space also needs to be kind of, like, inculcated in the script stage itself. Once we know a definite structure, a definite form, where we are exactly wanting to perform. Having said that, I had also mentioned that, because we're talking about space, I'll talk a bit about respecting the fourth wall and what happens when the fourth wall is not there. So we do know that Stanislavski has kind of, like, given us this concept. Not only did he come up with a particular method which actors often use, and a term I think often abused as well, we kind of very loosely say method acting, but actually there is lot and lot that goes into this particular style of acting, this particular style of performance, which is called method acting. Most importantly, I think what Stanislavski has done is that he has told us about the concept of fourth wall. He has made us conscious about the fourth wall. And when we are performing on the proscenium, the fourth wall has its own role to play. The fourth wall has its particular challenges, of course, and of course the advantages that are there. What is interesting is I was talking about how performance changes, how acting style changes once we have to respect the space and once we know what is the space that we are using. So if this was a fourth wall performance, if there is a fourth wall performance, and I'm say doing a performance of Harold Pinter's The Lover, so the entire conversation between Sarah and Richard takes place in a manner where they don't tell themselves that there is an audience. And the dichotomy here, the challenge here, the interesting part here is that they know that they are performing for the audience. So keeping in mind that you are performing for the audience, but at the same time, the performance style is such that you're oblivious, or it seems that you're oblivious to the presence or the existence of the audience, is I think what makes it very interesting. What we see as viewer, as audience, is this entire relationship, the equation between Richard and Sarah, two people who are wanting to come out of the monotony of regular relationship. They seek refuge in an alternate identity, and then they get trapped in that identity. They get trapped so badly now that they are not able to come out of that particular identity. And what happens between these two individuals? Written in a very, very typical Pinter style, where Pinter uses his traditional Pinteresque style of silence. Now, Pinter has a particular style of writing his plays, which is why he was given the Nobel, keeping in mind about his introduction to uh, Pinter's pause, which plays an important role in English grammar today. So, Pinter pause, there are three kinds of pauses or silences that we can get to see in a Pinter play. How one makes use of silence, how one makes use of the ellipsis, and how one makes use of the pause. And speaking of acting, what is very interesting is that how Pinter's plays, Harold Pinter's plays, performances, they are not confined just to the proscenium. They are pretty flexible. You have the liberty of making use of the space as a part incorporated in your acting style, in the direction style. Just what Pinter demands is that the actor pays respect to the use of Pinter's pause. And as I mentioned, that each pause or by Pinter, it has a particular purpose. So when he writes silence, there is a purpose. When he kind of continues with ellipses between sentences, between dialogues, there is a purpose. When he writes pause, there is a purpose. And all these three, they are actually supposed to help the actor perform that particular text or that particular segment of the text in a certain manner. So that is the beauty about Pinter's writing that we find, and the use of space as well. Now, if Stanislavski had told us about, like if he told us about the fourth wall, and if actors need to respect the fourth wall, Brecht came up with a very interesting concept. He said, break the fourth wall. So what Brecht did was he gave us the idea of, he introduced the idea of theater of alienation. And he said that you cannot afford to ignore the audience. Not that Stanislavski was wanting to ignore the audience. He wanted to keep the emotions that were kind of, like displayed, that were exhibited between the characters. But what Brecht said was, let us engage the audience now. We do that by breaking the fourth wall. So here I must tell us that, like what is this fourth wall? Um, when we enter a proscenium space, when we enter an auditorium, we get to see the three walls from the audience's perspective. And for the actors, the audience is as if there is a wall. as if they can't be seen. And what Brecht did was he said that you break that and then you kind of come up with a particular style. So what he does, what Brecht does, he moves away from just the dialogue and he brings in another kind of, like an entire plethora of theatrical elements. Sometimes we have placards, there are signboards, so much of live music is there. Today, of course, even in the Stanislavski style, music plays an important part in kind of enhancing theater. What Brecht does is that he does not keep it confined only to dialogues or exchanges between two people. He engages the entire audience. And then he says that once we kind of do this, we break away from the structure. We don't keep theater confined to just the bourgeois. Theater reaches out a lot more. And this is a style that Brecht then comes up with. And the reason why I thought that I'll kind of share this a bit is because structure in theater is a very, very interesting concept, according to me. As I was mentioning earlier, that it has become a part of the performance grammar. It's not right, I personally feel. Of course, here maybe I'm contradicting myself because I personally feel that there is no right or wrong when it comes to theater and cinema. It's a matter of perspective. But I just feel that for an actor, especially, whenever there is a performance, it's important to understand the structure. It is important to understand the space where the performance will take place. Where will the audience be? Where am I performing? Even in an improvised act, I'm always game for improvisation. And of course, I have a liability as an actor. In fact, I can't dare call myself an actor because, along with receding hairline, even the memory is receding. And my friends in Theatrecian, they have kind of barred me from performing or acting in plays because they feel that as an actor, I don't do my homework well, I don't learn up lines. But it's not that. It's just that I really feel that it's very challenging, it's very interesting once there is a lot of improvisation that is happening. And I'm not getting into a debate out here because there will be a school of thought who will feel that, yes, it is fascinating, and another school of thought who will feel that it is always good to stick to the script. Whatever it is, I just feel that it is important for an actor to understand the space, to understand the structure, realize what kind of communication is taking place, where is the audience, where am I, how I am supposed to pitch my voice, because an actor should be heard, an actor should be seen. And this I don't mean only in terms of celebrity glamour stricken artists, but what I mean is that once we are on stage, and here I will like to keep it confined to the performing space, the live performing space, and not the recorded performance. I won't discuss much about television, web series, or serials. But when it comes to the stage, when it comes to live performance, uh, the minute an actor, the minute a performer is on stage, it is important for that performer to be seen and to be heard. Be seen from wherever you are, be heard no matter whatever be the distance between the audience and the performer. And to understand that, to kind of, achieve that, uh, to some degree of merit, I think it is important that the actor respects the space. Having said that, I'm very keen on hearing my co-speakers and getting to hear from the audience and whatever questions that they would like us to field. I'm always game for that. I've always mentioned this to my, I can't say students because I don't believe theater should be taught. Rather, theater is to be shared. And I just kind of, like share experiences. So I've always mentioned this as a facilitator that whatever I say, please don't take that as gospel. Feel free to challenge. Whatever I'm kind of mentioning is coming out of my own experience. Your experience is different. Your idea to things will be different. So please feel free to kind of challenge, feel free to question. And having said that, I say the same over here. Whatever I have mentioned, please feel free to question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chato, for this very engaging and also very provocative in a certain sense, certain ideas. So, we'll take up those ideas later. during the Q&A session. So for now, the audience, please, hold on to your thoughts, gather your ideas, and put them in the chat box. We'll take them at the end. But now over to the next speaker. Before that, Ishaq will introduce Dr. Trina. Ishaq, over to Ishaq.
Hello. A very good evening to everyone present here. Um, Dr. Trina Nileena Banerjee is a very eminent faculty member. She's also a very avid and enthusiastic researcher, writer, and journalist. I'll now read out her brief bio note. So, after completing her Master of Arts in English Literature from Jadavpur University, Trina Nileena Banerjee proceeded to complete a Master of Studies in English at the University of Oxford. For her PhD, she worked on a history of women in the group theatre movement in Bengal between 1950 and 1980. She has also been researching the interfaces between women's movements and political theatre in contemporary Manipur for several years now. Her essays and reviews on these and other subjects have appeared in various national and international journals, as well as in several edited volumes. Between 2011 and 2013, she taught at the Theatre and Performance Studies Department at the School of Arts and Aesthetics in Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is currently Assistant Professor in Cultural Studies at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. Her essays have been published in several edited volumes and national and international journals. She is a bilingual writer. She writes in both Bengali and English. Her research interests include gender, performance, political theatre, theories of the body, post-colonial theatre, and South Asian history. She has also been a theatre and film actress, as well as a journalist and fiction writer. Her book, Performing Silence, Women in the Group Theatre Movement in Bengal, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press, India, this year, 2020. I now very warmly welcome Dr. Banerjee and would request her to please enlighten us with her take on this subject of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishaq. Over to you, Dr. Banerjee. So please go.
Okay. Hello. Good evening. Am I audible to everybody? Can I just check that first?
You're
Yeah.
audible.
Okay. I want to thank Anuparna, who I also know for a very long time, I think, for asking me to be part of this. And also thanks to IISER Bhopal. I'm going to speak very briefly because we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to speak very briefly about certain conceptual sort of trajectories that form the fundamentals of the discipline that I teach, which is in fact not theatre studies, which is performance studies. And I'm going to try and talk a little bit about that in order to come back to these questions about theatre space and practice, perhaps in a broader conceptual way, and then at the end try to point out the significance of some of these questions. I don't have any answer, but the significance of some of these questions for the current circumstances that we find ourselves in. So this might be sort of known material to those who are academic, sort of academically interested in performance studies, but to a lot of others, to theatre practitioners, these might also be concepts that are fairly new. So when I say performance studies, usually years ask me, even when I was teaching in JNU, कि क्या exactly क्या पढ़ाते हैं, मतलब अभिनय सिखाते हैं, acting सिखाते हैं, ये है तो ऐसे नहीं, वो NSD में होता है, तो JNU में क्या होता है फिर, मतलब क्या, what is this performance studies, what exactly is it? So then the second level of assumption is basically just like film studies is writing critiques of films and being sort of finding the analytical tools for reading and sort of analyzing effectively films. Performance studies might be something similar. So there are sort of there is performance as an object of analysis, and then basically you have a set of tools and ideas and concepts which help you analyze performance. Now, this is true for a lot of Indian students and scholars of performance studies, that performance studies is still fairly a fledgling discipline in the subcontinent largely. Even though in the US and in parts of Europe, it is very sort of well established. There are great departments with sort of fabulous infrastructures and fabulous teachers. In India, even though we have theatre departments where certain versions of theatre studies or practical sort of training for practitioners in drama is provided, performance studies departments are really few and far between. The one and the oldest is the one in JNU. I have a course that I offer in the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, but it is not definitely, as you see, my designation is Assistant Professor in Cultural Studies. So what is this performance studies business? So interestingly, we would imagine that when we think about performance studies, it derives out of some version of theatre studies. And theatre studies, as we know in Europe, largely sort of developed from a certain sort of field of literary studies. So therefore, in a sense, Anuparna was talking about a very interesting course. There were similar questions raised as people were teaching texts of plays in classrooms in English literature or other language departments, and they found that there was something missing in only dealing with the textual material. So there were questions that were asked about staging, about whether there is in fact a performance text that derives out of the literary text and becomes, something different, a different kind of entity. So these questions were very, very sort of commonly raised from within English literature departments, and so the earliest theatre studies departments in Europe perhaps became sort of housed within the literature departments. But interestingly, performance studies in America grows out not from literary studies but from anthropology, and this is very, very interesting because it grows in the late 70s out of specifically, and of course there are many other influences here, including performance art as it develops in America and the kind of push that theatre performance practice receives outside the proscenium. So there's a lot of performance art practitioners who say that the theatre is in fact a kind of cloister from which one needs to break out. The idea of, so we have Alan Capro with his happenings as early as the 1950s, etc. In the 70s, we have many, many performance art practitioners, both in Europe, including feminist performance art practitioners, who are very influential. So these questions have already been raised at the level of performance practice, but they begin to be reflected also in the field of conceptual thinking about performance. And so in the late 70s, there is this kind of strange alchemy between two people who sort of catalyze this process. And there are many others. It's always slightly unfair to sort of look at big historical shifts in sort of through biographical figures, but there is that level of unfairness there. But yes, this is a large part of the story, which is that Victor Turner, who was a very, very famous anthropologist at this point of time, begins to collaborate with a man called Richard Schechner, who is a theatre practitioner, but also, sort of a thinker of various ideas about performance. Schechner, of course, in later years, and for those who are in performance studies know this well, has been questioned and critiqued, and as well as mocked. Sometimes there have been huge, long debates with Indian performance studies scholars like Rustam Barocha, etc. But this is the history so far as we are concerned. That Victor Turner was talking about something called social dramas in his own work, in his work in cultural and social anthropology, and he was saying that you see a lot of and you have to remember that in anthropology, the big influence at this point of time and what has determined sort of the work of Western social and cultural anthropology is a certain kind of structuralism, which comes from Levi-Strauss. Right, so we are looking for structures. We are looking for systems which make sense, sort of grids that can be taken from one cultural context to the other and placed. And so then you almost sort of break down the structure of a myth to its bare minimums and find replicas of certain kinds of myths across the world, right? I'm putting it very, very bluntly and sort of really watering it down. But when we come to Turner, we actually find in his work, a return to the idea of process. process that is bound by time, right? And here he goes back to the work of an earlier anthropologist called Van Gennep, who in fact had talked about the ritual process in a certain way, where he spoke about liminal processes or liminal states in social transformation. And Turner draws from this work of this earlier anthropologist about rites of passage and about the ritual process to say that every society, whether we see them as quote unquote primitive or modern, complex, contemporary, and these kinds of sort of stereotypes still existed in the world of social thinking at that point of time, we find certain kinds of ritual processes, certain ways in which society enacts transitions from one state to the other. These might be small transitions, or these might be big transitions like wars and revolutions, or perhaps a pandemic such as the one we are in. So, Turner says that these social dramas, whether they are enacted within a small community or within a sort of what we call a complex, quote unquote, society, urban society, are in fact initiated by a certain crisis or breach. So there's a certain status quo, like let's say the seminar, I give this example in class often, maybe I've given it when I was teaching, Prodosh was auditing our course, I don't remember, that this class is going on, and one of you, and we are assuming a physical space, one of you gets up and leaves without a word, without permission from me, without anything, and that is a breach in the status quo. We don't quite know how to deal with it. Now, there are 3 or 4 possible outcomes from this, which is that I become very angry and I stop the class. I say this is a questioning of my authority and it's a sort of an insult to me, so the class stops because I stop it. Or it could happen that maybe the rest of the class suddenly realizes that they hate it as well and they all get up and leave, so then there is no class any longer. Or that some of them decide that they realize that why they understand why this person is upset, and they go out and they bring him back and there's a certain kind of resolution, and we come back to a more shaky state of equilibrium, right? So this, if you actually see many of the fundamental texts that we've grown up with, even when we're reading Shakespeare, we find that in Shakespeare's comedies or even in his tragedies, there is this process that goes from an equilibrium that is somewhat sort of unstable because there are seething resentments and sort of crisis and hierarchies and sort of injustices that have been repressed and written over, and it seems like a building that is about to break at any point, and then there's a crisis and a breach. You shift over to another world, which is a different sort of a reality where strange chaotic things, think of Midsummer Night's Dream, strange chaotic things happen, where hierarchies are turned over, where kings become slaves and actors become donkeys, and slowly through that process of chaos, there is a return to this earlier world to a better equilibrium, a more resolved equilibrium. There's a resolution, right? So, in a sense, you have a crisis, a breach, and a liminal space where things are overturned, where chaotic things happen, rules are broken. And through this apparent chaos, we reach a resolution where things seem to have either broken down completely, as in the case of certain kinds of tragedy, but you think that even at the end of Hamlet, there is a notion that there will be the beginning of a new order through all this destruction, the hope that there would in fact be something that is better, something that is more hopeful, right? Or in the case of certain comedies, the green world allows for the court to become a better place. To cut a long story short, so this ritual process of crisis slash breach, liminality, and then a return to a certain kind of equilibrium is a pattern that we find in a lot of drama as well. So Victor Turner, in fact, says that this pattern would be found in various kinds of social processes that we see around us, not only in primitive societies, but in what we call our urban contemporary sort of modern quote unquote worlds. And as he collaborates with Richard Schechner, we begin to then see Schechner taking up this idea and taking it forward to say that, look, what you practitioners consider to be theater is only a minuscule portion of what constitutes performance in this society. Performance is, in fact, everywhere. Right? So he says that when you actually think of performance, as theater, you are limiting it to a certain kind of performance frame. However, if we look at our own lives, whether we are actually attending a religious festival, watching a football game, uh, being part of a political process, attending a family dinner where one has to play a certain kind of role, sort of participating in a wedding, conducting a class. There are elements of performance that, in fact, permeate all of these aspects of our lives, right? From modern urban societies to what we consider what has largely been the Western colonial focus of anthropology, which is this sort of stereotype of primitive societies. But this is everywhere. So Shekla says then we need to also begin to look at performance not just as an object of knowledge, but a lens, sort of a piece of sort of equipment through which we can look at the world. We can in fact see elements of performance in all of these social processes, right? And so therefore, in a way, we move from looking at performance merely as an object of study, framed within certain intentional events of theatre, to actually looking at the different elements of performance in our lives. And this is not entirely new, because if we look back on it, we have the work of Irving Goffman, who really talks about the presentation of self in everyday life and the roles that we play in social circumstances. We have the work of J.L. Austin, who has already given us the idea of performative utterances. So there have been predecessors in many ways, but performance studies actually then takes this on as a sort of as the foundations of a certain kind of discipline. Now, from this place, then suddenly, so when we talk about then theatre practice event, we then see that somehow performance is a part of the practice of everyday life, of which theatre forms a sort of a section. We also see that the space of performance can be anything. It can be a michil or a julus where you're in a street corner shouting a certain kinds of slogans. I often ask my students, how do we know that when we are in a michil, we need to sort of hold our fists like this and do that? Who told us this? Where did we get that grammar? There's no text of this, but everyone does this, right? Or, I'm not saying that there are no variations. There are, of course, contexts and variations, but there are also patterns that repeat themselves. Alan Badiou has a very interesting text where he's actually, 2008, I think, the Rhapsody of Theatre, where he's actually sort of almost creating for us a table of a political event and a theatrical event, and finding for us how, in both cases, there is written or unwritten a preceding text, a certain grammar, that sort of a process of preparing and cooling off that defines both the theatrical event and the political event. So, okay, to move on to the next point, so suddenly we now have performance as a lens through which to look at the world, to look at various things, and this has, of course, led to very knotted and twisted kind of debates in recent years, perhaps between, say, for example, Marvin Carlson or Rustam Barucha's recent book, Terror and Performance, where he raises the question of about how far are we going to push this? If everything is performance, is an act of terror which causes death, which is a finality, also a kind of performance, right? So how far up can we politically, ethically, ideologically, theoretically push this idea, right? That everything can be read as a performance. But I'm going to come to a later point that I want to make, which is the question of space, textuality, and the body. So this then goes further forward when we look at the work of Latin American performance sort of scholars like Diana Taylor. And Diana Taylor in the early 2000s writes a book called Archive and Repertoire, where she is part of NYU and Tisch. And all these scholars are also part of that very thriving department at that point of time. But she's also making an intervention from a particular position as a Latin American scholar. And she says the trouble is that when we look at textual knowledge and textual archive and discursive knowledge as primarily where we are to find knowledge, we leave out a whole mass of people, a whole mass of cultures who do not live their lives, inhabit the world primarily as textual. How do they live the world? They live the world through performance, and that is the repertoire. This is a set of embodied practices a set of embodied learnings and processes that are transmitted from one generation to the other through body-to-body transmission, through memory, through a bodily memory, through an embodied memory, right? And this is once again not new, because these ideas have come up in the work of African scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o when he talks about the idea of orature, right? So therefore, finally, Diana Taylor makes this point that only privileged Western scholars can say that the world is made of text, right? Those who live different kinds of cultures, those who actually live the world through a certain kind of embodied knowledge, cannot speak of this in the same way. So Pierre Maurer, who is a European historiographer, talks about living memory and sites of memory, and Diana Taylor takes up that idea and says, well, there is no chronological before and after between living memory and sites of memory. It's a relationship of power. The archive continually announces the death of the repertoire so that it can turn performance practices into textual practices and objects to be held in the archive. So Taylor's primary point is that performance is autonomously in itself a way of knowing and inhabiting the world. It does not need to be translated into text and discourse to become knowledge, right? It is in itself a mode of knowing the world. Similar points are in fact made by performance studies scholars like Dwight Conquergood, who would say that there are two ways of knowing the world. This is the academic world will sort of highlight the way of sort of analytically looking at a practice, knowing its various elements, taking it apart objectively and scientifically, okay, to the whole Baconian tradition of establishing facts, etc. But there's another way of knowing a ritual. The best anthropologist, the most successful anthropologist cannot know the ritual in the way that the practitioner knows it. Because the practitioner has one crucial element that the anthropologist doesn't have. The practitioner believes that the ritual works. That element of belief is another mode of knowing and engaging with the ritual, right? So there is, he says, two ways of looking at a crowd: looking from above it, from a bird's eye view, where you can see the broad range of what the crowd is constituted by, what the movements are, etc., etc. And the other, which is often devalued, which is often left outside the hierarchy, is to look from within the crowd, moving, sweaty, jostling, being kicked and kicking around in the middle of the crowd. That is another way of knowing the crowd. Now, which position do we take here? So therefore, performance, and one, this is not to say that the way of sort of analytically knowing the crowd, knowing it from the bird's eye view, is worthless. The point is that performance has to be seen autonomously and as distinct from the discursive as a way of knowing the world, as a way of knowledge production, the preservation of cultures. Cultures are in fact preserved in the body, right? Even when they're not preserved in the archive. So therefore, when we talk about theatre space and practice, let's say performance space and practice, we have to begin to understand that practice is not merely the translation of a text. Practice is autonomously, in itself, a mode of knowledge. And for a lot of us scholars who have either transitioned from practice to theory, or those like Debleena who continue to do both and are struggling to do both, I think it's very, very important for us to remember that a complete translation from one culture to the other may not be possible, but also a complete translation from performance to text might in fact be impossible. So therefore, those two sides of ourselves almost schizophrenically continue to exist and negotiate with each other. And especially in the times of pandemic, we then begin to think what the digital does to this idea of presence and embodied transmission. While we are here and now with each other in the same time, where are we? I don't know where Prodosh is, I don't know where Debleena is, I don't know exactly where you are, where are you sitting, how exactly are you crossing your legs? I have no idea, which I can see in a class. Or if you're in a meeting, I don't know, but we are here. And so in online chats, we ask, are you here? But where is that here? Right? So we have the now, but without the corporeal. And what exactly is the transition in this absence of corporeality? We need to understand the implications of that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Trinadi. This is absolutely wonderful. You kind of broadened the scope of theatre studies to performance studies, and then kind of complicated it, problematized it, bringing in all kinds of participatory structures, rituals, embodied memories, and I think this will flow seamlessly into our next speaker's deliberation. So we have Debleena Tripathi next, and Binsi, if you could kindly introduce our next speaker.
Ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Excuse
can.
me. Thank you. Good evening, one and all. It is a great honor and pleasure to invite a person who loves to call herself a playwright, a theatre director, a lifelong learner, and learning facilitator. Miss Debleena Tripathi is a graduate student at the Center for Drama, Theatre, and Performance Studies, University of Toronto, where she has been awarded the Jackman Junior Fellowship to pursue her doctoral studies. Miss Debleena enjoys being a jack of all trades, but is particularly happy to introduce herself as a playwright, a theatre director, a lifelong learner, and a learning facilitator. Her first book of original plays in Bangla was published in 2019. She also goes by Munia. She has completed BSc Economics from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, MA in Comparative Literature from Jawadhpur University, MA in Applied and Participatory Theatre from Royal Holloway University of London, and is now, as I already mentioned, she is a PhD student at the Center for Drama, Theatre and Performance Studies at University of Toronto, where she is beginning work on contemporary theatre audiences in Kolkata. She has facilitated theatre class for children and adults in several institutions also. Miss Debleena had been a lecturer at the Department of Drama, Rabindranath Rabindra Bharati University from 2017 to 2019. She specializes in using theatre techniques for education and awareness and has worked with very different groups of people, from parents in villages of West Bengal to medical students in Kerala. Miss Debleena believes in and loves connecting to human beings. It's my pleasure to invite Miss Debleena Tripathi for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Debleena. So over to you.
Uh, Thank you so much. That was a very kind, very nice introduction. Thank you, Anuparna di, Antara di, and the whole department, all the everybody too. I'm very honored to be here, and thanks to my panelists. It would be easier for me to talk about what I'm going to talk because of the first two speakers. It's like an introduction as well. So Trina, they just introduced a new discipline, and I am going to introduce another newer discipline that is related to theater. And this is something that is very close to my heart. I'm super passionate about it. And when you are super passionate about something, it becomes very difficult to speak about it briefly. But I'm trying to speak about it briefly. And I don't want to rush. So if you think I'm rushing, just drop me a message. I can see the message box. Yeah. So when I decided to study, my topic is applied theater. I forgot to say that. So when I decided to study applied theater, it was in 2014. So I was often asked, what is applied theater? And is not all theater applied in nature? And if all theater is applied, what is special about what you're going to study? Why call it something different? And it is a valid question, but only if we overlook the history of the term. What is this history? So applied theater came into usage as an umbrella term in the 1990s to denote practices such as theater for development, prison theater, theater in education, children's theater, theater of the oppressed, etc. Now, even if you have not heard the terms, or if you have heard the terms, you can understand that all of these are different specializations, right? So what is the common factor? The intention. All performative activities or process-oriented creative activities, and here we are considering performances in the broad sense, like Trinadi was talking about, all such activities that are created or designed with the intention of making a positive change in the world around us would come under the heading of applied theater. Now, this is a very basic working definition, and it basically raises more questions than it answers, right? Uh, I could ask, or you could ask, what is positive change? Change for who's good? Who decides what is good? Why does the world need to change in the first place? And how does the world need to change? Who decides which way the world needs to change? Who does applied theater and for whom? And I'm not going to answer these questions here because clearly there is no single answer. There is no answer that is set in stone. Applied theater activities are inherently tied to the context, to the people and the place where the activity is designed, and the answers that we will have to these questions will be different based on that. So you must have noticed that I said that the term applied theater emerged in the 1990s. What was happening before that? Because the idea of using theater for other ends than entertainment is not novel, right? It has been there from time immemorial. So the term came into being in the 1990s, but the practices did exist before. Helen Nicholson, who is one of the topmost authors in applied theater, she has identified three main strands of practices that led to the dynamic ecology of practices that are now called applied theater: community theater, theater in education, and political theater. Now let us look at these three strands of activities in the Indian contexts. All these practices, as I said, were very much there before applied theater made its appearance in India, which was a little after it made its appearance in the Western academia. Just like performance studies, once again, like theater departments, a lot of theater departments in US and UK and other parts of Europe have become performance studies department now, or institutes host performance studies departments. And there are a lot of applied theater departments as well, applied theater courses as well, but not so many in India. I think there was one in Flame Hyderabad which closed, if I'm not wrong. And right now Robindra Bharati University, of course, has the MA applied theater course where I was teaching. So yeah, coming back to the Indian context, before applied theater came in as an academic concept, uh, a lot of practices existed, which will come under the definition of under heading of applied theater. So let's consider first theater in education. In 1989, Theater in Education Company of the NSD was established. There were theater groups going to schools, working with concepts of theater in education with or without government support. One such group is Nandikar in Kolkata, and they too started their TIE project in 1989. They have worked in hundreds of schools and institutions since then. And to what end? Why did they work in the schools, right? So I'm quoting this from Nandikar's website. To let the school children know their milieu and perceive their world through theater, to initiate their analysis of this milieu, to sharpen the interface between the I and the world, and help them assume the role of world changers. So it's not as if it started from 1989, but I can find these instances in 1989 and from after that. Political theater, Tathagata was speaking about Badal Sarkar. You know about Safdar Hashmi, you know about Utpal Datto, and their work is very accessible. You can find out about them. Community theater, I'll give you an example a little bit more in detail. So I don't know if you have heard of Bodhan Theater. Bodhan Theater is a group functioning from Chhara Nagar in Ahmedabad, Gujarat. So Charas were among the many Adivasi people who were marked as criminal tribes in British India in 1871. This meant that the state believed that these people are naturally susceptible to become criminals. And this law was repealed in 1952 in independent India when the criminal tribes were denotified. But on one hand, as you know, oppressive levels take a long time to actually go away, even after the law dismisses them. And on the other, many of the denotified tribes were not listed as communities that have long been underprivileged, and they could not access the constitutional provisions that were in place that were meant to balance out the inequality of opportunities that we had faced for so long. So Budhan Theatre has been performing in Charanagar since 1998. What do? They do many things. On one hand, they perform around the country to make people aware of the plight of the so-called denotified tribes. On the other hand, their work is directed at community building. They have a library at Charanagar, they hold film festivals, they have theatre workshops for children that are aimed at nurturing leadership qualities. Many of the senior members of Udon Theatre have been awarded fellowships and grants from the Ministry of Culture, from Ford Foundation, for their work, theatre work with their community. They also do something, and I find this really interesting. This is called playback theatre. They call this playback theatre, and they go to people's houses, they listen to the stories of those people, and they improvise plays then and there based on the same stories. And this is to signify that all our stories are worth sharing, all our stories are worth being heard. There are more examples, many more examples of activities of this sort. Uh, I could mention Olokananda Rai and Pradip Bhattacharya, who have worked in prisons. Process-oriented theatre work has been done with differently abled people in different parts of India. But why the emergence of this new heading called applied theatre? These all existed already, right? I will point out a few reasons. First, all of this work needs money, as you understand. Even more so in the 1990s, from around the 1990s, uh, when neoliberalization was on the rise, still, uh, these work even need policy level changes. And in order to convince funding agencies that you have to fund us to do this work, there needs to be some validation, some professionalization, some theoretical basis. We need to prove that our work is actually important. Here, remember what Trina was saying about the archive being the death of the repertoire. Formalization has that side. So as soon as you try to formalize something, make it written in stone, it sort of dies. The organic process dies. That's something we have to keep in mind. But there are other sides as well. Um, so another reason why behind the rise of applied theater, I would say from the last decades of the 20th century, the world has also been witnessing a revolution of transport and communication, as we all know. Diasporic populations are increasing. We are becoming more and more aware of our own identities with respect to the diverse populations around us. Concepts of race and gender are being questioned. There is increased mobility, and with that there is an increasing sense of precariousness. Environmental issues are becoming more and more important every day, and now we are entering a sort of now or never stage. Each day we are sort of understanding anew how quickly we are depleting the resources of the world. Just check the number of dystopic movies on Netflix. uh, you will see that all these changes make it more and more important to sharpen that interface between us and the world, for us to be critically conscious of ourselves, be critically conscious of ourselves and our surroundings. And this is where applied theatre is gaining importance, I think. This calls for professional training, for specializations. It calls for reflection and evaluation and accountability. It helps us develop a praxis, this renewed importance of applied theatre. Uh, it helps us develop a praxis where the theories are constantly tested and fortified by their application. On the other hand, uh, yeah, I mentioned that before. Uh, when someone funds you, they need you to prove that you're doing something right. And that is also very problematic because there's no fail-safe formula. because finally we are working with people. Whatever best intentions we have, it's never 2 plus 2 equals to 4, and you can never say that if we watch a play by Buddhan theater, we will immediately understand the plight of the denotified tribes and we will start acting responsibly. But these are nuances that we have to keep in mind. In applied theater, theory and practice have to go hand in hand. As an academic discipline, it draws from cultural studies, cultural geography, philosophy, psychology, women and gender studies, and of course, performance studies, drama and theater studies, etc. So let me bring in an example of a specific. Do I have 5 more minutes? Anuparna?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes, sure.
So let me bring in an example of a specific applied theater project that I was myself associated with. So I know all the details better. So this is just one example, and all the examples that I have provided throughout this talk are not exhaustive examples. They are not exhaustive of the range of work that come under the uh, umbrella of applied theater. So this project that I am talking about was called Ichamoti. There are some people who did participate in this project and they are here today. I can see Shupriyoda. Uh, so we were a team of about 20 people who had just completed a basic theater training workshop together. And as the facilitator, I noticed that many of the stories that came up in our discussions, our improvisations, etc., were related to gender. We were a group of people, a few of whom belonged to the LGBTQ community, and most of whom were allies, and some of whom we didn't want to say where we belonged. Maybe we were not sure where we belong. I noticed that there was a level of discomfort in discussing gender constructs in spite of the eagerness to do so, because we were careful not to hurt each other, not to impose our opinion on each other, which is a very good thing, but it also made it difficult to engage with each other. So here were stories that we were interested in, but we did not really know how to tell them, how to inquire about them. So we decided that we'll find a way through this maze with the help of theater. What did we do? On one hand, we kept sitting down and talking and opening up a little more each day. And we also tried out some exercises that were challenging us kinesthetically. We were guided by a great choreographer, Sudipto Kundu, and we moved in ways we were not used to. Ways in which the gender that we subscribe to is not supposed to move. We dressed in ways we are not used to, and our bodies responded to these movements and these dresses. These were some of the aesthetic choices we made in the designing of our process, and eventually we weaved our stories to a play. When we finally staged a show, each of us played a gender that we do not identify with the principle that we are not doing a mockery, but we are attempting to embody what we feel, whatever little we understand about another gender. In this performance, we tried to extend the space that we had created amongst ourselves to discuss for the audience. Many of the audience, of course, were less comfortable to open up to a discussion about gender than we were at the beginning. So we placed the story in an imaginary world of ghosts deliberately to create a distance from the real world that could arguably help the audience to think anew. And I'm not going into the story, which is complicated, but it involved a person who was determined to change their gender in afterlife. And she was confronted by the conservative ghosts, and she finally emerged victorious. Of course, she has to. So to place the story in the world of ghosts, to play genders that we do not identify with, are some aesthetic choices that we made in the presentation. And all these choices, the choices in the process, the choices in the presentation, are underlined by our ethical framework, by our worldview, by our intentions. I feel that if this performance made even one person question or rediscuss some of their preformed notions about gender, I would be really happy about it. And some of the audience feedback, we would not get into the politics of audience feedback, but some of the audience feedback indicated that there were some people who were angry, they were provoked, and there were some people who were reassured that there were stories similar to theirs. confusion similar to theirs. And I think both reactions can initiate change, right? Once again, I cannot claim that homophobic people will be rid of their homophobia once they watch our play. Not possible. But what it is a social experiment, a carefully designed social intervention. So before I conclude, I will raise a few questions. You can think about them maybe, and we can take them up in the Q&A session if you want. One space, which was in the tagline of the conference. Wooden theater, I just spoke about it. Where does wooden theater perform? Auditoriums when available, but mostly any given space. Classrooms, rooms, street corners, fields. Tathagata was talking about space. Remember that. And why do they perform in so many spaces? Because of course, auditoriums are more often less accessible than most of these other spaces, right? My question is, how do you decide where to perform? How do you decide who you want to engage in your performance? Second, notice that all the work that I discussed aim at facilitating responsible citizenship. Not all applied theater is aimed at that, but it is an important subfield that you could read up on. And my other question from that is that what other aims might there be to applied theater activities, as you have understood it? If you were to design a performance or process today to change the world for better, quote unquote, what would you do and why would you do it? Let's leave it there for now. I also have a list of books that you might want to read, follow up on. I'll post that in the chat box.
Thank you so much, Debleena. So again, Debleena, you have brought in the concept of applied theatre, and you were also making me very nostalgic actually, because when you mentioned theatre for education, because that kind of reminded me of my childhood in 90s, when we used to regularly watch these Nandikar productions and the Children's Theatre Festival and Shishurangon productions, which we do not get to anymore. But then that's another story. We'll quickly move on to our next speaker, Prodosh, because we're running out of time and we want to keep some time for Q&A. So over to Anu to please introduce our next panelist.
Good evening, everyone. I'm immensely delighted to introduce our next panelist, Mr. Prodosh Bhattacharya. He is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of English, St. Xavier's University, Kolkata. He is also pursuing his PhD from the Department of English, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. His research interest lies in studying circus by keenly looking at the traditions of writing and its myriad genres in colonial Bengal and the ways they frame knowledge of the body in multi-accented perspectives and through indigenous traditions of physical culture. He has also an MPhil degree from the Department of English, University of Kolkata, in which he conducted a comparative study of various notions of space in performance of Samuel Beckett's short plays and works of Badal Sirkar. Now I welcome Mr. Prodosh to share his thoughts on the subject.
Well, thank you for that gracious introduction. I really thank, I hope I am kind of audible and visible.
Yes, Prodosh, you're audible.
Right. So I thank Anuparna for, organizing this wonderful panel. I have actually, learned a lot, and being the last speaker it's a privilege, you pick up on ideas. And I also thank Humanities and Social Sciences, IISER, for, organizing this. And especially I would like to thank Trina. It was a bit nostalgic. It felt, I was sitting in those classes of hers when I was auditing this course back in 2014 at CSSS and doing a course on performance studies. And it was actually a process where I unlearned a lot of things, a lot of perceptions which you pick up while you do a kind of textbook reading of plays in classroom scenarios. So thank you, Trina, for so wonderfully putting across those ideas. In fact, it is kind of interesting for me in the sense that we talked of Diana Taylor. So if I may, I have a present. I mean, I've just prepared a short PowerPoint in the sense that I would want that while I speak, certain pointers to be in front. So is it possible that I can present it here?
Yeah, yes, Pradosh, it is
Yeah,
possible.
so just
And
give me a
the present
moment.
option, yes.
Yeah, just give me a moment before I set that up. So, yeah, I hope this is, visible. Right. So I would like to kind of pick up on a very specific issue, but in terms of the conceptual framework, I am taking a leaf out of Diana Taylor's work, Trauma and Performance: Lessons from Latin America. Now, I've titled this talk as Bearing Witness from the Visceral to the Public Dimensions of Memorializing. So what am I exactly trying to address conceptually? I'm going to look at three, let's say, I would say, traditions of performances, performance artists and communities of performance, artists and people. And I'm picking out three, instances, two of which are directly in the Latin American context, as Trina also pointed out. So I'm looking at the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and this is from obviously a study conducted by Taylor, where she was actually analyzing the grandmothers in Plaza de Mayo in the context of the Argentinian, struggle against the dictatorial regime from 1970s to 2000s. And then in that league, I also, pick out the work of Regina Jose Galindo, Who Can Erase the Traces? And she's working in the Guatemalan context, not quite different from the timeline that I'm referring to. In the 1980s, also during the dictatorial regime, and that performance was marked by, kind of a protest, an eruptive protest in the public sphere, which she enacted through the individual body, of her. So the body becomes important as well. So, so here are some of the points that, some of the key issues which I would be looking at. So it would be important while I mark out what I am setting out to do, to first mark out what I am not setting out to do, in the sense because there are two very heavy terms used here. One obviously is performance studies, but the other is trauma studies. And to be honest, I am not an expert in trauma studies. I mean, I don't have an initiation into trauma studies. But while encountering Taylor's work of trauma and performance lessons from Latin America, what did strike me as a point which was raised there was the fact that both trauma and the idea of performance has this concept of this reiterated repeats. There's a sense of repeat. This eruptive repeats, which is there in in traumatic memory as well, and obviously performance in the broader context beyond the theatrical spatial dimensions also talks about this reiterative repeats. So that is a point that I'm trying to pick out, but I'm not getting into the medical model of traumatic memory, which though is a very crucial point and maybe a kind of an analysis or experts there would be interesting to work together. The trauma studies and performance studies would work together. In this regard, also there is a profuse amount of literature, and which is very interesting, that on two interesting facets, which becomes important. That is, one is on traumatic amnesia, that is, forgetfulness in mostly in sessions where post-traumatic, let's say, survivors are actually kind of they go through a session and there's a sense of healing through this personal sessions. Amnesia on the one hand, and the other is a traumatic memory, a resurgence of traumatic memory. In fact, a profusion of memory, too much memory. And why I pick this out is because this becomes very important in terms of the concept of testimony. And the testimony is a very loaded word because on the one hand, it has a certain juridical notion, a certain legal juridical register within which it is used. So, and obviously in a legal juridical model, this kind of profusion of memory in survivors is at times kind of dismissed as not evidence, because there is evidence in trauma studies and trauma literature that you see memory itself is a process of generation. So it is not about the facts of memory, but it's about the rather affective tendencies. And I thought it is interesting in terms of what Trina did set out, that where lies the embodied transmission beyond cultures of textualization. So I put out some points there. I would then situate, and come to the main point that the moot point of my discussion is I'm trying to look at the performative currency and efficacy of trauma-driven performances that emerge and spill over in public places. Now, obviously, I have mentioned Taylor's work, so if you're interested, you could look at it. So Taylor locates the transformative potential of what she calls the performatic, this is the word she uses, at intersections with trauma studies. So obviously, performative is something which was taken from J.L. Austin, in his work, How to Do Things with Words. He talks about the performative utterances. But I think the major point that Taylor is trying to point out is the performatic, tries to denote the non-discursive realm of performance. That includes embodied acts such as, funerals, rituals, protest movements, that are bracketed, from daily life. So now, being someone who has always been only, kind of tangentially engaged in performance studies and doing what we usually do in literary studies is teach plays in class, to read plays in class and then do a kind of a hermeneutical understanding of plays in class, which at times is something which we need to revise in the classroom scenario as well, because classroom is an interesting space as itself. So teaching plays in class can have newer pedagogical methods. So since I come from that, training, I wish to point our attention to, in regard to the three, traditions of performance that I'm looking at. The mourning woman of Thebes in Oedipus the King. So we all know of that. Now, it typically represents the choric gregarity of mourning as a passive structure of societal motherhood. So this is something which is there, and over periods of time, various forms of tragedy. We know a few of these Celtic tragedies, Irish tragedies. Synge uses this idea as well. Now, what Taylor seems to be suggesting is, in her work on trauma and performance, is that there should be an iconoclastic form of mourning. So that transforms and transcribes, what is perceived as a passive form of mourning into protest and resistance. So, and this is a very technically difficult point. So I will not get into this, because it is fraught with certain contradictions, because it is remarkably gendered in the sense that you're talking about, at least in the first performance that I'm going to talk about grandmothers of Plaza Timeo, you're categorically talking about the concept of motherhood as a means of control of women's bodies, to a concept of mother activism in specific cultures. Now, does this mother activism entail a kind of reification within patriarchal formations? That is something we need to debate. So that is something I might pick up if you have questions. So I wish to point out that all these three performances in their specific cultural contexts are premised upon a gendered space that marks these performances. As all of these performances are brought to focus, two aspects become, central concerns. Number one, the context of intentionality. Now, intentionality here is not in the typical sense we understand. This is a term, obviously, within philosophical school by Aristotle has been picked up and goes on into talking about that it is about where thought is directed to. Even if the object is not present, the thought direct towards an object will mark an intentionality. And obviously, because in literary studies, there is this overprivileging of analysis of drama and dramatic plot. So intentionality will obviously have its own hierarchy of mimetic principles. So that is one point. The other point is obviously, which is more closer to performance studies, which is performative efficacy, which is what can performances do, how to do things in specific cultural contexts. So the movement from the Cartesian dimensions to the affective dimension of space perhaps may account for this heterogeneity of the efficacy of performance. The visceral and the non-discursive deployment of performance to reinvigorate the trauma, and this trauma is now a shared pathology and an experience of the families of the disappeared in the case of grandmothers of Plaza Timeo. So it's not trauma which is only located in the individual body, but it's a shared pathology in the bodies of the disappeared. So I'll come to the context of the grandmothers and mothers of Plaza Timeo. So this has now become a human rights organization. who struggle, for over the years for truth and justice in Argentina since 1977. Now, to put it briefly, it's very difficult to talk of performance as such. One needs to, also, have a look at some of these, maybe pictures or if there are ways in which it could be archived. So that's another issue. But it's very difficult to talk about performance. But to give you a brief summary of what was the context. So in April 30, 1977, 14 mothers gathered at the Plaza de Mayo for the first time. And among the mothers, they meeting weekly at the plaza, there were women whose grandchildren were also missing, either kidnapped together with their parents or born in captivity in the clandestine detention camps. So you can obviously understand there was a tremendous amount of violence. Almost 30,000 civilians went missing. And obviously this was a drive during the dictatorial regime to kind of oust the leftist, leftist-leaning crowd. Anyone who was dissenting with the government or with the state was kind of kidnapped. And what's interesting is young mothers, pregnant mothers, were also being kidnapped, and their children were, once they had given birth, the children were being taken away from them, and there's no trace of those children till recently. The grandmothers, as this human rights organization, has now stretched their endeavor beyond the Argentinian context and goes into finding any kind of what you could first say as the lost generation. So so these women constituted politically through their social vulnerability. So there's a social vulnerability against which they're constituted. Enact, so this is the point of performance stepping in. Enact through means of installations and through use of theatrical apparatus. They enact this kind of resistance. Whether it's a successful or an unsuccessful resistance is a different story. I mean, because we cannot have easy answers to that. But they certainly take up the mantle of using certain installations and apparatus to intervene the public space. Now, it was a sustained practice. It was not a one-day rally. It was a sustained practice from 1970s till there was an organization which came up known as HIJOS, which if it translates into English as Children for Identity and Justice Against Forgetting and Silence. Mark these two terms which I used. Now, the organization continues to use personal trauma to mobilize collective acts of condemnation. It creates this huge guerrilla type performances and acts of public shaming to target criminals associated with the dirty war. So there's this description of this. And so the transformation of these experimental and strategic restaging of violent erasure of those civilians who had been erased and captivated by the military regime of 1970s Argentina hinges on a crucial understanding. So how is this to be read? This is the problematic part. That are we just talking about a spectacle? How is this to be read? So how is this to be analyzed? How is this to be understood? So I would suggest that it could create an understanding of memory and memorialization that operate beyond linguistic registers of identity in accounting for trauma. So trauma in this context is not just a medicalized individual conception in the body of the survivor. It is a systemic and daily violation of human rights. And this is what Taylor talks about, that it's not just the pathology of trauma. She's not denying that. What she points out is there is a systemic and daily violation, like a slow poisoning of violation of human rights in the name of certain other forms of contingent operations. So, and the state's employment or deployment of trauma is in the form of a writing off of the public memory. So the state is writing it off. How is it doing this? Through a coercive erasure, through inscriptions, through letters, through documents, and creating archives. Archives that are not only obligation to remember, but also obligation to forget, obligations to forget certain things. So I think it is the grandmother's presence are against this absence of the archive. So it's this gaps within the archival logic where the presence of these grandmothers become very significant. In fact, if you look at their performances, their protests and demonstrations, which can also be called performances, in the sense that they take the photo IDs of their grandchildren and they march on the streets every day. Every Thursday, they used to march on the streets and gather on the town center of Plaza de Mayo. So what it does is this dismantling of trauma, or effort to dismantle trauma, is an enactment through the repertoire, as Trina pointed out, of bodily resistance. By inscribing on their bodies, as I said, the marks of the missing and the disappeared as a counter to the archival claim. So it is very important that we understand what is not scripted here and what underlies the logic of the script which is written by the state in this case. So in that light, I come to my next performance, which I would like to draw your attention to, and this is fairly recent. This is in 2003. Regina Jose Galindo is a performance artist, an activist. So she, did this kind of an impromptu, street performance, where she calls it "Who Can Erase the Traces," and it's obviously translated. Now, this actually stages the different endurances and alternate stories to the historical record of killings in Guatemala in 1980s dictatorial regime. So it's alternate to the historical records. So that's why "Who Can Erase the Traces." The performance reacts directly to military violence in the Guatemalan context, and she uses categorically, and I'll show you the diagram. I can't show you the video here. There is an archived video, but she uses a mode of disenchanting the public sphere. That is normally what seems as a decorous public sphere with graffitis and arts and decorous, kind of post-utopian art forms. She goes and kind of exactly, inscribes something sinister there, erupts, the performance erupts from that sinister point. So what she does is, if you look at this diagram, she walks from the Congress of Guatemala building to the National Palace, dipping her bare feet at intervals in a white basin full of human blood. Now, obviously, whether this is real human blood, whether this is some kind of paint, that is insignificant. I think the mark is important, that what is she trying to mark? She uses this mode of a very bodily, understanding of protest instead of verbalizing protest, a bodily understanding of protest. In trying to actually protest the presidential candidacy. So the context is she was protesting against the presidential candidacy of Guatemala's former dictator, Jose Efrain Rios Montt, who was the then presidential candidate for presidential elections. So she actually comes, and it is almost like she's trying to put in, these marks of erased memory of violence. So you might say that in this scenario, she is the singular body. But I think through her body, she is enacting what you would call memories of so many generations. So she is almost at that point, in that liminal mode of, in being in alliance with multiple bodies. So this is this important point, which I mean, from the aesthetics that we see. Now, in both the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo and Regina's performance, one finds what Taylor calls a repertoire that stores and enacts, embodied memory. The ancestral and intergenerational trauma, which is something on which research is being done now, is reiterated as a political memory here, as a kind of a communal memory. Through all these acts that Taylor calls, which are live, ephemeral, non-reproducible. So, in that then and now, in that here and now. So, while there are clinical and medical, rejuvenation of survivors, which have followed a certain diagnostic approach of healing in trauma, the trauma-driven performances through these two performances go beyond the medicalization of bodies to a more prognostic approach. This is what they're trying to suggest, of comprehending the source of trauma and its mediation in the biopolitical techniques of the state. So that is what Taylor's argument is towards, that let's not think of trauma only in the person who is surviving it, but also look at trauma from where it originates. So in this context, and slightly differently, I come to Maya Krishna Rao, and her performing body in this particular performance called Walk, which obviously, if you see the context, was immediately following the Nirbhaya rape case, and it was kind of her disappointment with the judicial processes going around the case. And in fact, 2016 she performed it in JNU. After in the interim period, Supreme Court's revalidation of Article 377 of Indian Constitution that criminalizes homosexuality has also happened. So it gathered and picked up on context. So she actually says that what she does is applied theater, as Debleena was talking about. So her performing body marks the thickened contours of the state and how it maps bodies. In a performance walk that was performed in multiple spaces from streets, schools, colleges, and institutions as a protest, but it was more a critique of the juridico-social system of justice. And an aspect of this applied theater is that it resides not in the phenotext. Christopher talks of the phenotext, but rather in the genotext of the violated body. So you will not have a script. It's almost like putting into practice what, remember in Julius Caesar, there speaks Caesar's wounds. Mark Antony is trying to put speech into Caesar's wounds. And that is exactly, if you take that metaphor and you expand that into the performative dance, that is exactly what is happening. So it's the genotext of the violated body which is speaking and performing here. I'm particularly fond of two phrases which she uses, where she says, I have to phrase this in Hindi, which she says that, जिन लोगों ने हमको चलना नहीं सिखाया, वो कैसे बताएंगे कि कहाँ चल के जाना है, and that's brilliant. If you have not taught us how to walk, how can you tell us where we will be destined to walk towards? So I think that's very powerful in the context in which it becomes. So it resonates with a certain amount of truth. What is this truth? A desire to be free from violence, to be free from abuse, but also to truth that this desire is lost in patriarchal economy, right? So in each of these performances, briefly covered, and I can come back, there is a sustained effort to bring to the fore the hitherto unexplored dimensions of incipient and insidious sociology of trauma engendered through systemic and routine violation of human rights. Public memorialization in this regard is markedly different from what you would find in museums and war memorials and Truth Commission reports. The performatic code, the praxis, rather situates memorialization in the site of witness, which is an eruptive and tenacious space, where the act of witnessing is both psychological and political. And this is important because even recent DSM formulations of PTSD, as you say, post-traumatic stress disorder, also enlists witnessing or learning about one's family or friends being exposed to severe dangers or exposed to traumatic stressors as something which is important as an experience in trauma as well. So the efficacy of trauma-driven performances, I'll round it up in a couple of minutes. The efficacy of trauma-driven performances perhaps lies in the possibility of bodies to form alliances, as Judith Butler would say, and to exercise rights beyond what you would call the legitimacy understood through classical notions of polis or state. Now, there are some questions which I want to, so as Trina said, there are no questions which you could greatly answer, but these are questions, more rhetorical questions at times, but questions to think through. So it thus becomes a great responsibility for performance studies scholars and pedagogical methods to not have modular formations around understanding and studying performance as a category. More so in the context of pandemic, because of the protein impacts on how we look at the world. One needs to take this as an opportunity to do a slow, deep, and contextual reading of the times, which has only, if read carefully and honestly, exposed our catastrophic social and political systems. So I think, especially, if you see the points that I've raised here, and I can come back later, I think the point number 3 is very important. From the singular to the collective bodies of women in this performance is to be looked. Is it to be looked beyond the modular forms of performance as rather a method of de-objectification within the structure of practicing? And this is a point I think I would leave for discussion. That is, for all forms of protest to work, whether a protest works, because there are a lot of speculations on Occupy Wall Street and a lot of things being written. What makes a protest work, but what makes it not work, is the way we are asking questions of the practice of protest. As we are thinking of protests as a form of self-performance, as a self-staging. I think there's a point where this needs to be understood. Readings of protests must be understood through a certain de-objectification within the structure of witnessing as a context. I think these are some of the dimensions of conceptual categories which, if we think through, we might, through a long practice, activate what you call the ethics of practice, as Trina points out, the practice which is a separate form of knowing. So with that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradosh. Again, very exhaustive, very thought-provoking. And really, we have today traveled a long way, folded into our discussion a whole lot of issues, a gamut of issues, in fact, from various articulations of spatial grammar to embodied memories, participatory structures and shared pathologies, ritual to visual, visceral, traumatic amnesia, so many concepts, from performance to performative and then performatic. So I'm sure we have a lot of questions. So what we will do is, unfortunately, we do not have a lot of time. So what we will do is, if you have questions, so we have two ready questions already from two participants. In the meantime, you can gather your thoughts. If you have your question, you can simply type your name and we'll just kind of, call out. But please sort of keep your questions short because we are running out of time. So that would be an earnest request. And I would sort of, doubt, I would kind of, I doubt if we're going to have too much time. I mean, we do not really have a lot of time, but we can still take, 4 to 5 questions. So I would request Aditi to kind of take over the Q&A session. But in the meantime, we already have, 2 questions ready. So one from Professor Shapun Chakraborty and the other from Isha. So, Professor Chakraborty, if you could just kind of, tell us your question, and Ishaq, be ready. In the meantime, the others can simply gather, their thoughts. And Aditi, if you could take over this session part.
I think first of all, I should congratulate and thank all of you for wonderful discussion and presentation. I just quickly go through my question. My question was to Tathagata, and that's kind of an answer to even Debleena's question, that what is the relevance of space? I mean, when you're talking about where the performance to be there, whether you're breaking a fourth wall or using a fourth wall, isn't that depends on what is your objective of the theater? I mean, what exactly you're doing. If I'm going to just have theater for the performance of something to be presenting on the stage or aesthetic sense, I might not be thinking about breaking the fourth wall. But if suppose I want to use audience as participants or want to have some political motive behind the theater or to engage people, I might go for breaking the fourth wall. And that's why I use the point that in Peter Brook's term, the empty space concept, that it doesn't matter. I mean, if you just one actor and one audience, and you can start off your theater. So that's my, I don't know, it's not a question to Tathagata, but just an add to what he pointed out. To Trina, I have one question. I'm not very, because it's a wonderful, and first time I heard about, I heard about performance study way back, but nobody taught that way. I mean, the way you presented, I mean, it's very, thank you for that. So I was not very sure because you're talking about textual versus non-textual performance, and you will say, I have a kind of opinion, is non-textual, isn't that more constrained in terms of time and space as compared to textual performance? So if you can put your thought on that. That's my question. Yeah, thank you very much.
I think Tathagata, do you want to go first and then I can respond?
Yeah, sure. I'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just tell you a bit from what I gathered. Chakraborty, what I could gather from your. I'm not sure if I got the question as such, but I think what you were mentioning is I had mentioned about performance in the proscenium space, and I mentioned about the street play, and I discussed about what happens when you break the fourth wall, and you are kind of doing something in a Brechtian style. So basically, what I feel is very important is that what is your purpose for theater? What is the purpose that why you're doing a particular play? Who are you doing that particular play for? In what is the purpose for doing that particular text that you have in mind, that you're coming up with a performance, and where you are performing? So sometimes what happens is, it's not that the text will have to depend or complement the space. Rather, what I said was, allow the space to be incorporated in your presentation, in the director's perspective or view, how you are presenting, how you are talking, how you're treating your text. Suppose you want to engage the audience within your structure, most welcome to do that as long as there is some sort of justification. Let's not do something just for the heck of it. And what I had wanted to discuss was um, just understanding and respecting space. It is important for a performer. Like I mentioned, that it is all about the mind, body, space, what the mind tells the body to do at a given space. It is important for a performer to understand the space where the performance is taking place, as much as the performer gives importance to the text. Whether the text is there or the text is being created, one gives respect to the text, right? So wanted to mention that it is also important, equally important for an actor to respect the space, understand the space, because the space will have its own grammar. The space will have its own language, and that language also needs to be communicated when the performance is taking place. Yes, Trina, you can go ahead with the next.
All right. Shopunda, if I may, thank you for the question. And I just want to say to start with that I was actually condensing a lot of ideas into sort of a very short period of time. So therefore, some things might not have been clear. But this is actually the question of time and space is one thing that I actually start my first introductory class with, where in fact I actually raised this question about how we can think of time differently in a text-based theater performance and in a performance art piece, so to say. So I actually, the two clips that I usually sort of show my students is the sleepwalking scene that, from BBC's production of Macbeth, where Judi Dench sort of does her soliloquy, a very, very famous piece of performance. And the other is a Buto performer who does a performance art piece in a Tokyo art gallery. Now, one of the questions that when I try to place before my students is that the scene itself, I mean, when you take the clip, it takes 7 minutes. Judi Dench doing this speech and the whole action of rubbing her hands together, the scream, the nurse's interventions, all of that, that takes 7 minutes. I often ask my students, how long is she sleepwalking for? The scene is 7 minutes, but how long do you think she is walking? Is there a correspondence between that 7 minutes and Lady Macbeth's walking, right? And the thing is, with theatrical time, this is not necessarily the case. The 7 minutes might actually represent a whole night. It might represent 4 hours. It might represent a condensation of 3 months of walking endlessly and saying the same thing again and again. Because that repetitiveness, that repetitive and obsessive rubbing of hands, the repetition of, to bed, to bed, to bed, this is basically the sort of the rantings of a mind slowly falling apart, of insanity. Right? And so the stretch of time, the sense that you get from there is this kind of endless time that refuses to kind of this nightmare that refuses to stop. So therefore, the 7 minutes is not 7 minutes. 7 minutes represents a space of time that is in fact, that could be 3 months. The opposite is also true. In some of Shakespeare's last plays, you can go from one act to the other and 20 years have passed, right? So half a minute, change of scene, and you are seeing the characters 20 years older. So this is actually possible in the translation from text to performance, in the sense that there is in fact an element of representation where Judi Dench's body represents the absent body of Lady Macbeth. So there is that notion, the early notion that Aristotle sets out of mimesis, the imitation of an action. Right. So therefore, that bipartite structure is very much a part of this divide between as if and it is in theatrical time. This is not necessarily the case in performance art, which is non-textual, in the sense that how long does it take for you? What kind of this will be true of different kinds of sports. So, for example, a football game is time bound, but it takes as long as it takes for you to do a sort of a triple somersault in gymnastics. Right. So the action time defines the time. It is not either bound by time, not representing another time. So for the Bhutto artist, the whole action of 10 minutes consists of coming out of an embryonic position in the floor and standing up. And this actually for the artist, which an action which might take half a second for me or for you, or or maybe sort of 5 seconds, 10 seconds, for him it takes 15 minutes, because this is a technique that Bhutto draws from kabuki, from elements of no, that a single action which could take in real life a few seconds is drawn out through sheer strength of muscles, through a certain kind of skill, to a sort of a prolonged period of time. So you can actually see the whole effort of holding, sort of the prolonging of that action. So this has, of course, aesthetic and political implications. But the point is that there is no text that action represents. There's no represented time and no actual time. There's no as if and it is. It takes as long as it takes. Who is the Bhutto performer? He is the Bhutto performer. He's not the Bhutto performer playing Macbeth or Hamlet, right? So therefore, in textual theatre, the primary concern is, in the older sense, mimesis. In the present sense, perhaps the idea of representation. In performance art, a non-textual performance, representation is no longer central. That bipartite structure has fallen apart, as if and it is have come together, which is why performance art, when you see Marina Abramovich bleeding, she is really bleeding. It is not paint. She does not represent bleeding in a certain way, right? So this relief that you have in knowing that Othello is actually not throttling this beautiful girl, and you can come out with this sense of catharsis and and knowing that Desdemona, the actress playing Desdemona, is fine after the performance. That safety is no longer there in performance art, right? So in a lot of performance art, which is why there's so much experimentation with pain, I think, as well in the 70s, in a lot of work. So therefore, my point is that the whole notion of time, in fact, is, rather than becoming limited, it becomes expansive in a certain way. Because the action takes over the time. You're no longer sticking to the structure of a text, or the sort of, no time is being simulated. 7 minutes is 7 minutes. And that has myriad sort of implications. Right? I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, before I sort of, try to look for the questions in the chat box, which keeps disappearing every second, I just want to thank all the speakers, because, so much to think of. And I'll stop talking and I'll look at the questions. So there are a couple of questions asking for explanations. And then there is one long one by Ishak. So Ishak, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, ma'am. Hello.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. This question is for Dr. Banerjee and Mr. Prodosh. So I'll just quickly go to it. So the question is about the idea of street plays, which are very common in India, and like where or how do these exactly fit in the concept of theatre that you've discussed? And my second question is to Ms. Debleena Tripathi. I loved your idea of the play that you performed. I wanted to just know about like exactly where did you perform it, and in terms of the idea of space that you many of you have mentioned, and also if you could mention some canonical Indian plays of the playback theatre form that you had mentioned. Thank you so very much.
Hi. Pradosh, I think you should take this. I think I've already spoken a lot. Just
okay. Yeah, I mean, thanks, Ishak. So if I got your question right, what you're trying to ask is that the tradition of street plays that in the Indian context that we have, how does it fit into what we just discussed? Now, there are multiple ways I can look at this. What's coming right into my mind is, number one, in terms of if you're talking of street plays as performances. So if you do a analysis of Sardar Hashmi, for example, so most of his there's not what you call a script. There's not a text out there, right? So it's mostly, as in sync with Trina, this idea that there's a context through which the text is developed. So Maya Krishna Rao, I would extend the term street plays into performing in the public sphere. So it is not only about the physicality of the public sphere; it also changes the political notion of the public sphere. Because there are a lot of ideas and debates on the political notion of the public sphere. So the point is, there is always a chance that you can only kind of get into a self-aestheticization or self-aesthetic model of these street plays as merely a change of setting. That is how you could look at it from a very theatrical perspective. But the point is, this is not just a change of setting. This is the change of circumstances. This is a change of the theatrical apparatus itself. Not that theater is not happening, but what is happening is certain theatrical models are now being used to ask questions of life. So you're asking theater-like questions of life, which is opposite of what Aristotelian mimesis was telling us. You're talking life-like questions of theater. You're asking whether theater is an apt representation, or what is the role of theater as a representation. Now you're getting into the public sphere, and you are almost trying to say the reverse. Almost in reverse trajectory, I would say, asking theater-like questions of life. So it's almost the as if and it is, which Trina pointed out, is something which is and there are subtle layers. So street plays could be scripted, could be unscripted, but performance art, and a slight pointer there, as Marina Avramic points out, she pointed out. I would also make a small mention of, in terms of space and time. I think Trina remembers this. We had this kind of very small assignments which we used to do while we used to audit courses. So, and some of these assignments would be to innovate and present our performances instead of speaking it out. So in fact, we had done this, and this is where exactly the space-time issue comes in, and it's contextual to the question that you asked. That is, we created a group of 4 or 5 people, and then we had 4 colors. We took colors which we use in Holi. We took colors, and the audience was given a sheet of paper. It's almost like some kind of pointers to initiate. And the point is that someone would have to throw a color on any color. It could be, and these colors would have connotations. So it was red, orange, X, Y, Z. So 4 or 5 colors, and there was a color kept as white chalk powder, which is neutral color. Now, you see, the efficacy of this performance depends on the fact that if for an instance, no audience chooses to throw a color on us, we are meant at that point to stand like statues. So we are like statues. We are not mobile bodies. We are bodies waiting to move, to be initiated by the audience. And so it can so happen that the audience doesn't interact, leaves and goes away. And it might not work. So it's this. So what performance studies is telling you is asking you through accidental questions and not through modular platforms, using certain theatrical apparatuses, asking questions which are deeper, which are not very different from what you do in theater studies, but it's like expanding an aspect of theater studies too wide and and bring it in front of you. So I think if this answers your question, I mean, in terms of how street plays specifically can be looked upon in the context of performance, I think the public sphere idea and this is what occurs to me. I think if Debleena can add.
Hi, Ishak. Thank you for your questions. I'll take the second question first. It's quite easy because you asked about the canonical Indian plays of the playback theater genre. They don't attain the canon because it's about hearing your stories now and making up a play from it now, and then it's not there anymore. So it's momentary. There's no text that can make it to the canon. Does that answer your question? There are some groups you can look up who do playback theater. There's First Drop and Yours Truly Theater in Bangalore. There's Alternative Living Theater in Madhyamgram. I think they definitely did something similar, but I don't know whether they call it playback theater. So there are some more groups, of course, doing this practice, but nothing makes it to the canon as such. And the second question, thank you for that, the first question, because this project is so close to our heart. If I start talking about it, I don't stop. So I was trying to make it brief. So I think I did not mention the space. It was a very boring space. We performed it in the auditorium, in Ganmanch Auditorium, and there was a reason for that because we only performed it twice, and that was sort of a place that we knew, the place that we saw had some idea about what kind of audience we could expect. Of course, I do not know who exactly will turn up, but we had some idea about that, and we wanted to play around that. So does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Mr. Bhattacharya and Ms. Tripathi. Thank you so much for your answers.
Great, thanks. I think we have, well, I still have questions, but I will let Natasha ask. It's pretty long question. So Natasha, if you could explain your
Condense
question.
it, yes.
Yeah, condense it and
Thank you, ma'am. So my question is for Trina, ma'am. Firstly, I would like to thank for the insightful definition in like the difference between theater and performance. So actually, through my question, I basically want to understand it more. So my question was that what is the kind of space that is being created through performance and theater for the third gender, because so there are some examples which I have given wherein people from the third gender are writing, directing, or in different forms the text. But what I want to ask is, are they actually also there, like on the stage? Are they really performing? So as ma'am mentioned that the definition of performance would be something authentic, something that is not a translation. So that is what I want to ask, that what the gender, the body that we are seeing as in the performance, is it not fraud? I mean, because the actors are actually not from the gender. So this is what my question was, and it would be a great help, ma'am, if you could suggest some a text which discuss this issue. Thank you.
Okay, this is a very, very broad question. I don't think I can answer this sort of conceptually, because there are many elements to this. Because, as you know, when we talk about the idea of the performative, one of the major ways in which sort of Judith Butler discusses analytically the idea of the performative is through the question of drag. And she tries to actually sort of unravel the question of the performativity of gender, its artifice, in fact, and its sort of discursively constructed nature through a long discussion on drag. So there is that aspect which is conceptual and theoretical, but I think there's a more sort of specific, empirical bent to your question. And to that, I would say that recently, if you are speaking of the Indian subcontinent, so to say, I had the good fortune of reviewing a particular play amongst three or four others. This was at the Serendipity Arts Festival, which is held annually at Goa. This was in 2018, and I was commissioned to do not really a review, but a long discussion piece on 5 plays on gender and sexuality. One of them was really striking. It was a Tamil play written and performed entirely by trans people from Chennai, from parts of Kerala, and these were women who had been part of the the activist circles for a very, very long time. This is also partly tied in with the protest against the trans bill as well. And while there was somebody who was cisgender male who was the director, so to say, his name was Srijit, and he was also very, very talented young person, but the play itself was really entirely narratives of these 12 or 14 women, their life narratives and what they had been through, and the kind of encounters they had with the power sort of structures of the heterosexual family, the sort of the heteronormativity and paternalism of the state, in dealing with people of the trans identity, as well as their own personal lives, their romantic and erotic relationships. It was a fascinating performance. I frankly have not seen anything like this on the. I mean, I not that I know everything. I mean, obviously, I mean, my range of having watched performances is also limited. But on the proscenium stage, something of this range and scope and power about the lives of trans people I have not seen before. The play is called uh, Parayan Marana Kadakal, which is sort of Kadakal is tales or narratives. So the narratives of those who are, I think roughly the translation is narratives of those who are sort of silenced and marginalized and suffering. And that was a brilliant. So if you can, I think it is still very current. I mean, it's not a very old production, 2 or 3 years. So I think if you can, and there is some writing about it, including my own essay. So I think if you looked for it, you would find sort of reviews and material, and maybe you can catch a show as well if it shows somewhere near your. But conceptually, this is too complex a question to write, sort of talk about immediate. And I'd say this generally. I saw a lot of questions in the chat box. If you want to sort of collect them and sort of hand it to your teachers, maybe Anuparna can email them to me, and I will try and sort of itminan se with some time answer them over email. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I think we only have time for like one last question. So what I'll do is I'll try and see if I can combine a couple of them and then tag along mine, and whoever chooses to answer can answer, maybe. One question is about how does the language of the play affect the performance of the body and the effective use of space? And I think there's another one which you could relate to it, I suppose, in which are actors able to represent time through the acting without taking the help of spectacle and clothes and clock? So about, well, the use of, I suppose, both props and language. I'm not sure if, I mean, I can actually connect them. I'm forcing it a bit. But I suppose my question is related a bit to this, and I'd ask this to you as performers as much as theoreticians, actually, is that one thing that I did gather from today's discussion was this decisive move away from actually text to practice. So it's not simply about bringing the text within sort of this space of performance and time, but it's about well, the performance sort of, you know, a kind of sui generis space for performance. And as somebody trained in Hindustani classical music and then also sort of, you know, a big fan of jazz, I was just wondering if there is some sort of, you know, either, you know, an essence of the text that sort of, you know, is still there, or if it's, or even like, you know, in jazz when you have like just maybe a slight note like do do do, and then, you know, everything is improvised around that. Or is it, or within the performance, is there something that is brought in, you know, and that would be something maybe for Debleena as well to think about in applied theatre. I know my question is going all over the place, but for example, when Brecht speaks of Lehrstück, you know, the kind of didactic theatre in which the performance sort of itself changes the text, but then do you find yourself in performance falling back on certain practices, certain ways of acting? I was just wondering, you know, if, whoever wants to take the question, I'd be very happy to have some answer from you as performers. So
I'm no longer a performer, so I'm going to step away from this. I'll let the ones who are still doing it talk about it.
Maybe Debleena, if you have like something to say about.
Yeah. Sure. I don't know if I can address the whole question, but at least parts of it. I'll say as a performer, first language. So I mainly perform in Bengali, and I can see myself moving differently when I'm performing in English, because yeah, I know English, but it's different. I just don't connect to the language in the same way. And as for props, did you ask how props and set properties are used in order to represent time.
I think that was one of the questions in the chat box. Yes, I repeated that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So no, I don't think so, because of course they can be used, but we do a lot of plays nowadays without any properties, without any costume or makeup, or we just do whatever with whatever we have, in whatever space we have, and it's really simple uh, to represent time. You will understand this, like if you watch children play. uh, just for example, they just say that, oh, so now it is morning and now I am going to do this, and that's time represented, done. So we don't need props for that necessarily. uh, and the other thing you asked, sorry, what was the last thing you asked?
Yeah, sorry. No, those two were not my questions, actually. I was repeating them. Mine was a long, complicated question. I just sort of added on to it. It was more about how much does the fixed enter, sort of fixed ideas, if not the text, then just maybe practices that have been there for quite some time in the improvisation that is done, and how does it affect, the limits of the improvisation is what I was wondering about. Shorter version of my question. Yeah.
I'm thinking, Tathagata, that if you want to take it.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I think I find similarity between this question and, like about the language of the play affecting the performance of the body and the effective use of space. So basically, firstly, I'll tell you that how I'm going to define the word language in itself. Here, I will not confine the word language to just, like what is the language? Is it English? Is it vernacular? Is it French, Spanish? That is not how I'll be defining this. And I'll tell you my reason for this. And to answer what ma'am was also asking, see, where the text is concerned, a playwright writes a particular play. A lot of factors influence the playwright, socio-economical, political, um, climatic also. In Agatha Christie's plays, we will find that climate plays a very important part. How London has a character of its own. And all these factors, they'll influence the playwright. And then the playwright writes about the time that the playwright belongs to. And then the text is available, the play is available. A lot depends on the director's vision. Why is the director choosing that particular play? If I have to choose Hayavadan, or if I have to choose Edward Albee's The Zoo Story, why am I choosing the Zoo Stories written sometime in around 58, 59, written by someone who specializes in what one will call theater of the absurd. And I am presenting it in today's context. I'm presenting it in today's times. What is it that I'm wanting to show in the Zoo Story? So that is one question that I have. Secondly, for whom am I performing the Zoo Story? And finally, where am I performing? Am I performing this on the proscenium? And when I'm kind of making an attempt to answer this, please, this goes for everyone who has this question in mind. Please, what I've often believed is there is no right, no wrong. It is just your perception and how we are presenting the perception and how are we communicating, whether that communication is striking a chord. So if I have to go inside Academy of Fine Arts and perform the Zoo Story, that will demand a certain language because there is an immediate distance between the audience and me. Suppose I take my phone this far away and I'm talking to you, I need to use my hands, I need to use some extra gestures in order to make this communication happen. But the minute I kind of bring my lens closer, the minute I bring my device closer, I know for a fact that I do not need that slightly exaggerated performance. And I can still kind of communicate with you. I can still strike that chord. So when I'm performing the Zoo Story inside the Academy of Fine Arts auditorium, there is a certain language that is demanded from the performance, from the actors. The actors have to follow a certain grammar in order to reach the last row in Academy of Fine Arts. This will change, obviously, the minute I come out from there and I'm performing just in front of Academy of Fine Arts and it becomes a street play. The text is the same. If you are going to now ask me that, can it be justified performing the Zoo Story as a street play? I'll according to me, I'll say, why not? It is not a, it's not a given rule that it can only be performed on the proscenium. A lot depends, as I was saying, that, a lot depends on where am I performing and for whom am I performing. The minute I'm performing the zoo story and I kind of come up with this performance where Jerry comes in and tells Peter, I've been to the zoo, have I been walking north? I think I've been walking north. There is a way of saying this. The kind of response that Peter will give Jerry, not, I think so. There is a certain style of saying this as well, which will be different keeping in mind what is the space, where is the space where I'm performing this. So this is how I feel the script, the space, and the actors, they are all correlated.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, that's very well answered. The question of the dialectics of text and performance. I think we don't really have time for one more question, but I'll let Antara ask one because she had asked quite some time back. So Antara, will you ask your question and then that'll be the last?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. I think I'm stretching this quite a bit, but
no worries. Do ask. Yeah, please.
Just wanted to come in. Yeah. First of all, thanks a lot to all the panelists for this wonderful set of deliberations and range of ideas, introducing us to range of ideas and concepts about the body, space, performance, trauma, and so on. So this was kind of about what Trina ended with, and I was kind of really intrigued and wanted to know a bit more, but that's where she ended. So maybe Trina or Tathagata, whoever wants to, can take this. So I was just wanting you to reflect a bit more on the digital, because you kind of ended with this, what the digital is doing to the corporal and the body and space. And of course, I mean, I understand it's quite a broad question, but in general, I mean, not only in this COVID moment that we are living through, but our lives have been invaded by the digital for quite a long time. And so what is the digital doing to rethink, open up the idea of space when we are thinking of performance and the body? And Debleena was talking about, diasporic communities and movement. And so the idea of space or an audience which is available to us digitally instead of performance in a particular space, what does that do to the idea of performance?
I'd like to kind of, tell you what we have been doing, because I'm glad that just very recently we were actually I didn't know about this when we first started doing what one will call the Zoom plays. But later on, we were told that we were the first in the country to kind of come up with this concept. In fact, we have done an extract of Vijay Tendulkar's "Silence the Court is in Session." We have another performance coming up on Independence Day, and we have tried to talk about the boys' locker room concept in the performance. So basically, if I have to answer this, I'll tell you that I personally hope, believe, feel, and think, and definitely pray that this is a makeshift space and this is very, very temporary. Keeping that in mind, I must tell you that as a performer, as an actor, as a practitioner of live performance, I don't believe that recording something and then airing it is live performance. Live performance is what we are doing right now. All of us are engaging in a conversation. We are having communication over here. Sometimes we are being able to communicate what we are saying, might be striking a chord. Sometimes that communication fails. But there is still a communication that is there. There is conversation that is happening out here. There is an exchange of ideas, exchange of experience, sharing of experiences. So according to me, what I feel is that in the digital space, one still needs to make that attempt and recognize that space first, and then the act must go on. despite the intensity of the pause. So to keep the performance alive, live performance still alive, going online, I think what the challenge is how I make use of this frame. The challenge is how I'm still being able to communicate. And this is still live performance. It's just that the stage has now shifted from the stage to the digital space. So instead of, I think, like cribbing or cursing, because that's the first thing that would come to my mind. And as I said earlier, that I just hope that this is very, very temporary. But as long as this is what it is, this is there with us, I think one just needs to be a little more open to the idea, explore this space as well. The content needs to be a lot crisper, of course. The content has a lot of limitation. You can see that, like there is this limitation of space that I have when I'm communicating with you right now. How much of me can be seen? And as I mentioned, an actor needs to be heard, an actor needs to be seen. How much of gesture can be expressed and what will still connect with the audience? So this is my reading of the digital space, and as long as it is there, we just need to kind of, like keep the performance alive in this space.
I'll just quickly add something. I have shared a link in the chat box, and that was a digital theater piece of digital theater that was created long before the COVID situation. It's called Rihanna Boy 95. It's a play by Jordan Tannehill, and in some sense, it was live. Like, let's not talk about it any longer. But if you want to watch it, any of you, the students present here, it's very interesting, and it plays with the concepts of gender. It's meant for young audiences, and it plays with the notion of liveness and digital performance.
I'll just quickly just say two sentences, which is not two sentences, a little more than that. This is a huge debate in in the performance studies. And this is not today's debate. Theoretically, if I'm to address this, it's a very long debate. It started in the early 1990s, and this is for Antra specifically. The person to go to is somebody called Peggy Phelan, who writes a book called Unmarked: The Politics of Performance, where she basically argues that the very essence, the ontology of performance, consists in its liveness, in the fact that it cannot be recorded. What is recorded is not the performance, it is merely a kind of note or a mnemonic device for the performance itself. And she makes this paradoxical statement that performances, only life is in the present, and performance becomes itself through disappearance. Performance is performance because it disappears. What is recorded and circulated in a sort of in a representational economy is not performance, right? So it's defined by the liveness and the presence. What I was saying in the talk today was actually drawing from another essay by Diana Taylor. I don't know, Pradosh, if you haven't seen this, you should, because you're interested in her work. This is a lecture I found that she delivered in 2010 called Foreseeable Futures, where she's basically talking about this transition from the sort of the textual archive to the digital archive. And she says that the digital actually mixes elements of both the archive and the repertoire. It gives you a sense of ephemerality, but on the other hand hoards huge resources. So the digital is in fact doing this constantly. And she says that in the digital we have the here and now, the immediacy in terms of time of a live performance, but we lack the corporeality. So we have lost the physical proximity, the what we considered the sort of the visceral presence of bodies in proximity to each other, but we have the immediacy and some of that almost simulation of democratic exchange, in a sense of serendipity, of risk, of accident. The connection going off, or somebody being allowed to interrupt another person, etc. So, but the thing that she says at the end, Antra, is the thing that struck me the most. And she's actually proposing this concept called the skeuomorph. And she's drawing this from the work of somebody called Catherine Hales. And the skeuomorph is basically an element of design that mimics something that is obsolete. So for example, when we delete something on our computer, and I was just saying this in another seminar yesterday, when we delete something on our computer, we have this icon of a rubbish bin. Right, and that the rubbish bin fills up as we delete things, and when we empty it, there's sometimes a sound of a bin being overturned or a flushing toilet, right? The point
Yeah,
is
exactly.
that this digital dump is neither a rubbish bin nor a toilet, but the mimicking of those sounds and those icons allows us to comfort that there is some continuity between our earlier modes of knowing and inhabiting the world and the current digital modes. So it basically, the design element that reminds you nostalgically of an obsolete design simply gives you your memory a comfort of continuity. But this continuity, Diana Taylor says, in fact does not exist. So she would actually radically disagree with Tathagata to say that what you're doing in the digital space is not the performance that you're doing in the proximate space. Sometimes you're almost consoling yourself that there is that continuity, but it is only shifted to another medium. But she's saying what we know is radically altered by how we know it. So therefore, that discomfort of that radical shift is something that we have to encounter, I think, at this point. In short, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
This
Thanks,
can actually open up another session of
Sure.
debate, but I guess that we'll kind of just discuss that in some other time. And yeah.
Can I, if there is time for a small, because I was thinking through what Aditi ma'am actually, the question that you addressed regarding.
Thanks. Do not call me ma'am, but yes.
Yeah.
Because we're running
I'll just give a small point because I was thinking through this, and this is crucial.
Thanks.
In a sense, you were talking about the idea of, is there a kind of a central point of whether you call it a text or a language around which you improvise. Now, interestingly, I am reminded of, because it's closer to my research. So two things. Number one thing is that if you look at mostly 20th century traditions of textualizing on theater, that is theater practice, in fact, it resorts back, as Trina pointed out, to kind of primeval or primitive concerns. In fact, certain aspects which were there in bodily practices were not written down. Now, very specifically, this is relevant in a particular kind of a, let's say, bodily practice, which is called the Lati Khala, which was there in the 19th and early 20th century. I mean, it has a long tradition, but it was being written about profusely. Now, the point is, which comes first, chicken or the egg, if that kind of an argument is there. Now, Lati Khala had been something which was learned by, from the thugs, thugs who were in most of these jails, and the thugs who picked up this because they were from various kinds of outcasted margins, so they knew their tricks. Now, what happened was there was a gradual way in which this was being formalized without there being written discourses on them, till we come to a point, at least in accepted knowledge, till we come to a point in 20th century. Kulin Bihari Das, he writes about a long discourse on Ostrocharcha, which is talking about the art of war, and in fact, it's quite interesting that he was, there's research on this, that he started to write and kind of compile with diagrams and bodily positions. In fact, some of these compilations and some of these traditions of writing were influenced by Japanese, body practices. So it's not that there was no Lati Khala before, but with the coming of Japanese, interactions with Japanese body practices, which happened in Shantiniketan because, Tagore brought a lot of these people to talk. What started happening was Kulin Bihari Das, and because it was also a time of what you call the extremist nationalist principles. So suddenly they're entered into this body practice as a textualizing practice of coding it down. So I would say that, and there is innovation there as well, because you see the weapons or the devices that the Japanese forms of these body practices would do is quite different from the lathis. The lathis would have the small lathi and the big one, the sticks. So it's different in terms of the prop that you're handling. So what was being adjusted, there was a kind of a hybrid kind of a documentation of the same, where the small or the big lathis and their structures were now adjusting to the written codified influences from Japanese. So I would say that yes, it's true, and it is both ways. I mean, that chronological dimension is kind of in 20th century research, it becomes difficult to.
Yeah, actually, thanks a lot. I mean, that's really fascinating. And when I was talking about Lehrstück, that Brechtian thing, it was also from Japanese sort of practices.
Yeah.
But I think we have really run out of time, and Anuparna is going to sort of kick me out of the meeting if I talk more to you. So I think we'll continue this talk later, and I'll let Anuparna take over.
Thank you, Aditi. Yes, we're not going to hold the participants any longer. I think it's time to remove ourselves from the digital, whether it's recorded or live. So let me quickly wind up by thanking our wonderful panelists, Tathagata, Trina, Debleena, and Prodosh, for sharing their time, wisdom, and skill. And in fact, Debleena has gone ahead to share a book list as well. So that's quite a thing. Thanks to this very lively audience, and we're sorry for not being able to take more questions, but kind of treat this, as treat this evening or treat this experience as a little gateway, like, Tennyson's Ulysses, who says that, all these experiences are like, arches or portals through which we glimpse that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. So, I'm very hopeful that this event is going to kind of forge ties with other events to come. A very huge thanks to Dr. Antara Chatterjee, Dr. Aditi Singh, and all my other colleagues in the department. And very importantly, a big, big thank you to all my students, Anu, Binsi, Rashdu, Nishak, who are always busy with something or the other. But when I call them, they're all there. So thank you all and good night. So I think it's time to bid adieu.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank
It was
you.
a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.